Welcome to the video today. Today we're going to look at taking this idea of using scalar and ReMidi and things like the Orchestra 2 and many different VSTs and how they work together to give us this endless pool of ideas, but taking it to a new level where things are more structured, more focused, and the ideas are getting better in that when you do play a key, really the chances of it sounding really good, all these combined, have gone way up. And so I'm going to play a little demonstration, and then we're going to get into the nitty-gritty. We're going to go into Cubase, but we're going to look at how the MIDI is structured for these tracks. So without getting too complex, let's just play some musical ideas of what I'm talking about, then we'll get into the details. All right, so let's start off with just some strings. So this will be a solo violin playing our first musical idea, a little motif, a little musical sketch, so to speak. And every key I press down on my 76 key keyboard will give us a different little musical idea. And they're all 1 bar long. So I think you're getting the idea. And so what happens now, though, if we go with that theme of starting with one instrument and building on that, let's just hold down one of those musical ideas now. And the entire keyboard is filled with these musical ideas. And these are just blocks of MIDI that I created, right? Which we'll get into all that. But just to show you when one, I focused in on strings for this first demonstration. But you could do this for every instrument in the orchestra. So let's now just hold down one key. I'll pick any random key. All right, now let's start. I'm going to keep it holding down that one key, and then we're going to add instruments that are going to hopefully combine with this. Now I'm going to hit the next key next to it. Next key. So you can see how all these original musical idea, if we go back to just soloing the emotional violin, that entire piece as the orchestra plays, and I just picked a few instruments to get this going, but you can see how it just works. And so next we're going to talk about how to build these original musical motif ideas and to have the entire orchestra play along with it on endless variety with an endless different orchestra instruments all laid out on your keyboard, which will blend and play and layer together in endless ways. So it's really, for me, it's been really exciting just playing this for hours. Now, you got to also think that I'm not a professional orchestrator. So in my mind, I'm thinking, what could a real orchestrator do with a system like this is really something to think about, you know. So let's now look and focus in on how we set up the MIDI for this. All right, so here we're back in Cubase, but this time we're at the first part of this two-part project. In the first part, or the first, I would say, Cubase project, you do all the MIDI, and in the second half you perform. So you have all your instruments set up, and you use all this MIDI in your second Cubase project. So it makes things a lot simpler because when you're using ReMidi, you can literally create all your MIDI separate and create one MIDI file which you have multiple tracks in, and then it's used in the performance project, and you no longer have to worry about the MIDI. So it makes things a lot easier. So this is the way I look at it now, having kind of progressed with this idea of using scalar, ReMidi, and things like the orchestra and a bunch of different VSTs and sonokinetic. It's really getting good in the fact that once you kind of figure out a few rules, you can preset everything up so that when you're ready to go to your performance project, you're literally just playing keys on the keyboard. And things just work so nicely together. You're not worried about, you know, adding a sonokinetic VST, thinking, oh, all the key binds are going to get screwed up, you know, the key switches, and how's it going to blend in, and how to. It's all taken care of for you in kind of an elegant way. So let's focus in and see how we do this. And I've given this some thought, like how to explain this in a way that is simple and effective. So think about it like this. So when I think of creating a new project, I simply say to myself, okay, what theme do I want to go in? What direction? It may be scary or epic or, you know, heroic, cinematic, classical, jazzy. Okay, so once I determine that, and I'll just write this down. So I'll say, well, in my example here, I went for a classic. So, and just started off very basic, right, to work all these issues out. So this example is done in 4/4 time at 120 beats per minute in the key of C major, right? So that's what I determined my theme for this was going to be. And so you just write that down, and then you can say, well, if I want to go classical, you can pull up scalar, and you can say just that as I did here. So I just went down to classical and picked the first one as just, you know, a very simple way of doing things. So I grabbed those scales, which were down here, and that happened to be a very long one, so there's a lot of chord progressions in here, right? So we've got, I think, 19 chords in this progression, which is really good because it gives you more and more variety. So I just dragged out all these into a track. In fact, the first track here. And so that's how I came up with my classical chord progressions, just to start with. And that's what we have here. And if we zoom in a little bit, we can just see it's in the key of C, and it's a classical chord progression. All right. So that's the theme for this entire idea here. But once you do this, you're going to have an endless variety of classical musical ideas. My next one I'm going to do is probably going to be more on the kind of in a D harmonic minor, which I like to do a lot of, kind of a scary, eerie kind of theme. And so in that case, I will, you know, delete all this MIDI here, but I'll keep all these tracks, so I don't have to redo that. So the great thing about this, one of the great things is that once you have your template kind of set up, you're simply just deleting the tracks, adding new tracks, going into something like scalar, or creating your own chord progression, which I do a lot of. But then, say if I wanted to go into something scary in a D harmonic minor, I might go for something cinematic, horror 1, 2, 3, 4. You know, there's so much you can pick from, right? So the idea here is that you just have an endless flow once you get this kind of system set up. So, but as I said, we went with classical. So first thing I did was dragged out all the chord progression here. And the second idea I should tell you about here is you set up your key, your chord track in the right key, which is C major, right? And that's no problem. And but my keyboard is 76 keys, so it has 76 keys that I can push down. So you want to make sure that your project here, if you look at the top, goes all the way right to 76. So having actually I could have made one more key here. I didn't realize till later on that that's actually 75. So if I would have made 76, that would have been better. But you want to have the exact amount of bars in your template as you have keys on your keyboard. And that'll start to make sense as I talk more about this. So that means, you know, when you bring this large file, which will be one MIDI file, this whole thing all together, all these tracks, that will be saved as an export MIDI file, and you'll just name it. And in this case, I named it Classical 1 4/4 time 120 beats per minute C major. That's how I keep track of all my different themes, right? So, but yeah, you want to have that 76 keys, or if you had a 61 keyboard, you'd go 61 bars, right? So that allows that every key on your keyboard will have one full bar of music. So if I zoom into, say, the ostinatos here, that allows me, and let me zoom in to bar 1. Okay, so that means that this is bar 1 here, from 1 to 2. And that means this is one key on my keyboard. When I press it, I get this musical idea of these notes. And that's what you heard when you first heard that violin, just playing one musical idea. And every key can be a different musical idea. So you just, you know, you can drag in this case, I wrote all these by hand, just drawing in these notes. Tested out a lot of different ideas, and some were good, some were bad, and I came back and made changes. But you could also get a lot of that MIDI data just from dragging in different performances, as long as you have your scale set up here, your chord progression. You know, you can drag out performances. And I did some of that with some of these tracks down here just quickly. But my focus was these beautiful, well, in my case, I think they worked really well, little musical phrases for a violin or the high strings. And so I created a lot of them. You can see here. Some I have some notes that are a little bit off key to give a little bit of dissonance here and there, which adds flavor and spice to the orchestra as it all builds up. Some are just ostinatos that give you all kinds of different ideas and qualities to every keystroke you do. But you can see I literally got many tracks of these. So I made a couple hundred of these different ostinatos set up for strings. And in this case, so I've got ostinatos in scale, fast, and I've got a secondary, you know, track of those. And then I did some ostinatos tutti for the entire orchestra, and I made a bunch of MIDI for that also. We can just zoom in. And so you have all these musical ideas, but I made sure that they all are made for one bar. So this musical idea here fits in right between 3 and 4. That's one bar, 4 beats. And when you do it in this manner, in 4/4 time in this case, when you're playing it on your keyboard, all these musical ideas will stay in time, and if you create a musical idea that is similar, so it's so easy to say that, okay, if you like this one here, you can just make a minor variation of it here in the next 4 keys if you want to be able to do that. And in many cases, that's what I've done, made variations. But so it works really well in the fact that every time you press a key, you get a different musical idea, but it's still all within your theme. You see what I'm saying? So even though these are all vastly different MIDI notes here, they're all, if I just drag this down, they're all in the key of C, which with the chord track, and since you're using the chord track colors here, see the beauty of it. If you want to, you can go outside of the key to add a little bit of spice, but generally if you stay in the key, all these musical ideas will blend nicely together with your VST orchestra as you play it. And it just works really, really good. And there's a few other tricks that make this all just kind of magically work. So this is the first time that I actually created a lot of my own custom MIDI to be played back inside of ReMidi. Before I was using a lot of just what ReMidi had, and it works nice, but I thought to myself it'd be so much better if instead of just randomly dragging and trying different tracks inside of ReMidi, how much better would it be if you actually created your own MIDI blocks of ideas all in one theme, one key, one time signature, beat per minute, how it's all going to, instead of maybe getting 1 or 2 great little combo ideas when you press maybe 10 or 20 notes, almost every time you press a note, you're going to get a really nice musical idea. And some of them are spectacular just by accident, how this all works, because you're really taking these motifs or these small musical ideas and you're mixing and blending them in hundreds of different ways. And as you do it, you can capture all those really great moments that are happy accidents. And if you make your own custom MIDI, your chances of having these spectacular happy accidents are really, really high. And so also, like I just said, if you do find or have one of these happy accidents, you can capture it inside of Cubase simply by just recording the MIDI, and then you can bounce it to audio, or you can just keep it in that project, but you have it captured. So you could make libraries of spectacular orchestral musical ideas. So now we're going to go into a little bit more detail and the other tracks that I created here. Okay, so we just talked about how I created these custom musical blocks of MIDI, but because Scalar gave us our original chord progression, it's all set up. So it's set up in the right key, C major, and we have our performance key chord progression down here. But this one's a very long one, so you have to go through a couple different patterns here of it. But it's all here, right? It's all in tune, in key, and the right chord progression. So if I've created maybe 5 tracks of custom stuff, if I want to just get a little lazy, so to speak, or just want to work faster, I can pull some of the great stuff out of Scalar. So I can just, what I did here was I said, okay, I want some melody tracks in this key and scale and progression. So I just went to performances. I went down to melody and just, I've said this before how you can do it. Everybody knows how to do it. And just dragged in, so you lasso every pattern, drag it into a track, drag it into a track, and ended up with some melody ideas, ended up with some chordal ideas, some rhythm, some performances. And these are just kind of things to fill in for the orchestra. But the great thing is you could go into here and you could, if you were an orchestrator or really knew how to create these MIDI notes for every instrument in a really great way, you could go in and customize all of this. But one thing I did do in kind of a quick manner was, in some of the cases, and let's just zoom out. So if you look at this entire 75 bars of music, again, it should have been 76, but I just goofed up there. But this is spread across my keyboard, right? And it's copies. So up to here, up to 19, because I have 19 chord progression. Then it's copied over here, and so it's copied 4 times roughly across the bars. But there's no reason why you can't change some of this as you go across your keyboard. So you could have very simple chord progression at the beginning, more intricate, more complex, maybe more rhythmic, and even you could have inversions over here towards the end. You could have inversions up or down. And instead of having just triads to start, you could end up with 5 note chords inverted up here at the end. The key point is, since you know every bar is mapped to every key, as you play that musical idea on your first note of your keyboard, and you're playing and getting really some great results and a bunch of different ideas, but you know that as you move your hand down the keyboard, it's going to get more and more complex musical ideas in that same theme. That's a really, really powerful idea, because not only have we got all these great endless ideas on every single key, you can determine, because since you know every bar is mapped to every key, you can say, well, as I'm kind of doing some musical ideas at the beginning here, I want it to get more and more complex in the verses, right? So I can just move my hand over and do some really complex. Just by moving my hand down the keyboard, I know it's going to get more and more complex. If I want some simple ideas, I just move my hand to the front of the keyboard, the beginning of the keyboard, where the chords, the rhythms, the melodies are all simple. So in essence, you got endless variety of musical ideas. But in this case now, I discovered that why not make it more and more complex as you go down the keyboard? So you take the MIDI notes down here and just chop them up more. If you may take a quarter note and chop it up into eighths. You may take chords and, like I said, invert them and give them some extra notes, some harmonies, right? So you can just imagine what a real orchestrator could do with this idea. He could say, right, okay, I'm going to create my own custom chord progression, something really beautiful for, classical music or whatever. Then I'm going to, drop all those notes, but I'm going to make it more and more complex as I go down the keyboard. So I have an endless variety of that original chord progression. Then I'm going to create some beautiful ostinatos for the strings, right? It's all going to be custom stuff, and they're all going to be different as you go down the keyboard. You could have certain, like I said, simple stuff at the beginning, more and more complex. And you could do that you could create custom MIDI for every part of the orchestra. And I just really did it for this test for the strings. But I'm already through, hours and hours and days of testing, beginning to see that it works spectacularly for just lead strings. You can imagine how great it would work if you took the time to customize all your instruments. So right now I just have some basic bass notes, I'll say low notes here, that I just kind of drew in, because it takes time when you're creating custom. But the thing is that every note that you draw in is going to give you 1,000 different varieties of potential musical ideas. So it really is a cost-effective use of your time in the long run. And so, yeah, from there, you want to decide, how many tracks you want to create of MIDI. In this case, I've got a lot of MIDI notes here. And, but also, you want to say to yourself, you'll probably say to yourself, well, it'd be great if I could use Sonokinetic with this. It would be spectacular if I could just, really use the power of the Orchestra Complete 2 in this. Or, Perk X or Storm Drum 2. And that is absolutely possible because all you have to do, and I've kind of talked about this in other videos, is once you know your theme, you know your signature, you know your beats per minute, you know what, in this case, Sonokinetic, we've talked about this before, Sonokinetic, and I'll zoom in again, needs straight triads. So from my complex chords up here, which have more notes in them, from the original notes are different. Some of them have 4 notes, so that wouldn't work in Sonokinetic. But I just make the closest possible changes to, I want to make Sonokinetic triads, and you can do that. So you just got to get rid of the notes that aren't, you want to take those 4 or 5 note chords and make them into triads, 3 note chords. And that isn't that hard to do. And so now, because I did that, and I know where Sonokinetic needs these chords, right between C1 and C2 or C3, right? I just make sure that all those same chords are all written between C1 and C3. And now, because I have this track here, I can use all kinds of Sonokinetic products that will blend in the tempo, in the key signature, in the beats per minute, the key. And so now Sonokinetic, as I demonstrated with the Maximo, just blended in as I played my musical ideas. And I did the same thing for Perk X in this case. I know Perk X needs notes to activate on it's C2 to C3. It can play 8 different, well, I think it can actually do 16 at one time, but 8 is more than enough. Just ignore these notes down here. I was doing an experiment with it, but I found out I didn't even need these notes down here. But the idea is for Perk X, I just wrote in these notes that would hold down the note, basically activate all 8 tracks of Perk X all the time. But you're saying, well, who wants all 8 tracks all the time? But the thing is, when you open Perk X up, you can just turn on and off different tracks as you want them. So I could just have a little bit of cowbell here or there, a little bit of triangle. It just works. So, and then the same thing, you want to divide up some of your chord notes. So I've got the high notes of the chord, I got the mid notes of the chord, for you can do divisi with your strings, right? So I took my cello and I said, okay, I want to just, some of the mid notes of the chord and low notes. And so I can have my cello just playing, in that harmony of that chord. And did the same thing with the bass notes. I chopped up some at different parts of the keyboard. I went 16, sometimes I went simple notes, so that I would always have a variety of different bass happening. And I have the bass whole notes here. So any MIDI in the theme that you can think of for all the instruments that you may want to use, you can simply make a track of it. And once you do, you're going to end up with a lot of MIDI in your theme. And then you simply just drag it all, zoom out, and you should select it all. Make sure it's all set up for a MIDI export, right, within your locators. And as I said before, just go and export it as one MIDI file. And that one MIDI file, named, again, Classic 1, 4/4 time, whatever. That one MIDI file, then I bring into ReMidi in the Performance Cubase project, which we'll go back to and take a look at now. All right, so we're back in the Performance Cubase project part of this. And since we did all our MIDI work in the other project, all we have to do for this now, almost all the work is done. We literally just have to grab that file. In this case, I've got it here. And that's that MIDI file that we saved that has, I don't know, 20 tracks of MIDI on it. Simply pick one of your pads up here. Might as well just pick the first one. Double click on this, which will load it to your pad here. And then you'll have to wait because it's importing, in my case, thousands of MIDI notes. So you'll wait a couple seconds. And when you do that, in this case, I'll just reload it, right? So I'm double click just now on it. And it's in loading up all those 20 or 22 tracks of MIDI, and which this will, when it's done it highlights. And notice they're all activated. All the tracks down here are activated, right? So ReMidi 2 has a very handy button now, which, you know, if you're using just one or two tracks, you don't think of this as being a problem. But you don't want them all activated, and you just want the track that you want for this one instrument, the violin, right? So you can just clear all, hit the clear all button. Then I simply go to my emotional violin, which I've got set up. So I know this, I'm using the Violin 1 Elite to drive my emotional violin as an example here. So I'll just go to the ostinatos, right? So we want to see some of my custom, so to speak, ostinatos for the strings, high strings. So now that is loaded. If I want to go to the next one, I just load that one. If I want to go to the next track, I'll load that one. And I've got my rhythm tracks here. Just make sure that you turn off the one. You just want the one activated track with the MIDI. So you have all your MIDI here at your fingertips. And it's so handy because you can turn them on and off just at will. So if I want to try my violin and just use the original chord notes on the violin, I can. But they're playing just one chord every bar. Because the original chords wasn't made for a violin solo or ostinato, but you can do it. Right? And you can add to it, so you can say, okay, I want that MIDI to play, but I also want an ostinato to play above it. So, or a melody, right? So now I just added the melody notes to the chord. So it's really a great way that this works, and it's so handy. But now I say, okay, I just want to, do the ostinato thing. So let's try 2T1. But even though 2T's made for the whole orchestra, it'll still sound okay in the violin. All right. But that's a little bit low for this high violin, so let's just say, okay, I want to bring it up an octave. And we can shift it, or we can double the speed. There's just so many things that I've talked about before, and people that have ReMidi know you can do. But so all these little musical ideas now are going to build our orchestra. So that's what we did. We just assigned different instruments. I added a bunch of VSL Elite tutti strings to fill in. So if we turn those on, they're using the same, they're connected to the same channel. So, you'd probably, if you're watching this video first, this could be confusing, but if you watch some of my past videos, you'll see how this all works. And it's all logical and works really well. So if I want to drive my VSL Elite strings, tutti, so if I just bring up that interface here, we have more of a section here of violins, right? So we have tutti, violins, and they're playing all the way from high strings to low strings. But I can say, okay, I want that same because I have this instrument connected to the ReMidi. So the same ReMidi here. This ReMidi is in the input for both. See here, ReMidi Violins 1 Elite is for the Violins Elite. And it's also, if I click here and look at its input, you'll see that it's the same ReMidi Violin 1 Elite. Just name everything. Make sure you title everything correctly, and when you need something to input on a channel, you'll know exactly where everything is. So for this violin, I said, okay, I want the input now to be this particular ReMidi with this channel. So I simply just go up here, pick the right one. So now in this example, we have the single lead violin, emotional, being backed up by the tutti or full band strings, going from low strings, double bass, all the way to high strings, violins, all playing this one little ostinato. And it starts to build, right? You can see how it's... And it's all in the same time, in the same theme. So now I can just turn on the bass, which I did the same thing, and get some bass going with the orchestra here, the Orchestra Complete bass and VSL bass. And now it's fuller. So now you can say to yourself, let's make this a little more interesting. You can do the same thing. I can go to Perk X and I can say, yeah, I made that Perk X MIDI. So now let's just hook it up. So I get my Perk X interface here, drag it in, and it's all set up. I have 8 tracks, but I can just turn on and off whatever channel I want. And so I can just get one little loop going if I want, and I can pick every single instrument, right? So you can say, oh, I just want to add a little bit of wood sounding percussion, a little bit of hi-hat. So you can just drag stuff like that in, turn on whatever tracks of it you want on, and then you have your Perk X stuff. In this case, we've got it set up for a big sound. And because we have it dedicated, if we were on our Perk X channel here, we can just say, oh yeah, ReMidi Perk X channel. That's the one I made for Perk X. So now we should have some percussion with that. If I turn the mute off first. And let's just drag this in. Now I'll have percussion. And let's turn on some bigger sound here. Let's get some more percussion. All right, so now we got Perk X hooked up. No problem. All the work's been done. Once you see how this works, it just becomes second nature. So now we can say, okay, let's get a little bit more interesting here. Let's say, okay, let's turn on a Sonokinetic product, which is a unpitched percussion. And let's turn that on using the same idea that I made a ReMidi MIDI for Sonokinetic unpitched, right? So I know exactly where the notes need to be down here and what chord needs to be played. And in the case of Sonokinetic or some of the instruments, you want to make sure, and I've mentioned this in other videos, that if you're using something that has a lot of key switches that are going to screw up, if you have MIDI data coming in and pressing these keys down, it might activate this one, might activate that one. A simple solution is that you set up your MIDI modifier for any of these troublesome tracks with key switches. You go to MIDI modifier, you turn on the note filter, and you set where you want your keys to be unfiltered. Everything else will be filtered except from C1 here to C2 or G sharp 2 in this case. So only these keys will be activated. There can be MIDI data coming in all over this keyboard, but only the blue keys that I want perfectly for this setup will be activated and pressable, right? So after you set that up, you never have to worry about that again. And all of this is saved in your master file. So you save as and call it Cubase Classical 1 theme, and you're set. You never have to do this twice. So you've set this up, and I've just begun here. Like I said, I'm just using the high strings really as an example. I've added some quick percussion and some quick bass and stuff. But you could end up making custom MIDI for your woodwinds and for your brass, and it's just really from all the different things I've tried over the years here, this is by far the most spectacular and rewarding, because the musical ideas I'm getting just from the custom high strings and messing around with adding some brass here, like in this case, Maximo strings from Sonokinetic. So if I turn that on, same thing. I've got it set up here with the MIDI modifier. So just the right keys that will be pressed, nothing else will get screwed up. And I can literally just pick and choose any ideas of high strings that I want or low strings. And, you know, if I turn that on now, and this is set up, right, with, if I go to its input, again, ReMidi triads for Sonokinetic. Just name everything correctly. So I know this is a older Sonokinetic product, and it needs certain triads, chords that are plain. It can't do diminished and other complex chords, but I know it can do the basic chords. So that's what I put in this track. So I put that as its input, right? And those chords are all in the key, in the theme. And simply now I hit any one of my 76 keys and let's just go with high strings here. See how that adds just a little bit of interest there, just these high strings, everything else turned off. And it's in the right chord and scale. And as I talked about before, you can offset it with some harmonies down here just by turning on. You can get into harmonizations and more complex things as you get more comfortable with this. But it's just... Now you can do the same thing with the brass, so I could turn on the brass and then you can add more things. You can fill in with the orchestra. You can say, okay, I want some kind of tutti low pizzicatos, which I've changed up here. I've actually customized this to some marcato, staccato, and a couple of pizzicatos. But that's all driven by the same MIDI as, in this case, you know, if I go to the right channel here, let's go to 2D strings, it's driven by the same Violin Elite ostinato. So if we just move this out of the way, or we can just leave it here to see how it plays, you can see the notes. And again, I got to turn this on. And let's just solo that to see exactly what we're getting. In this case, it should be the bass. I actually had the wrong track there. All right. So this is the low pizzicato and a little bit of staccato on marcato. And as we add everything else to it. So you get all these ideas to play with and stack as you like, and whenever you find something that's working for you, simply activate, record all the data either with the ReMidi track, or then you can have it also play back and record onto your actual VSTs. So any way you want to capture this, you can capture it. You can capture the ReMidi notes, which then can be altered and customized. So instead of making transitions with your fingers on the keyboard, you can actually just draw in MIDI notes here on the MIDI track and have them precisely transition from one key to the next. So you have perfect timing. And then when that's all set up here, you have that play into your VST tracks and give you the exact customized MIDI performance with all your instruments. So it all just works, and you can watch some other videos where I go into more detail on all of this. So this video has been a lot of things to explain, and if you're new to this, your mind may have just shut off a long time ago saying this is just too much. But the fact is, just like climbing a mountain, you just have to get from one point to the next point, and then before you know it, you're standing on top of the mountain. And in this case, I'm getting exactly what I've wanted out of these VSTs. And that is to pick a theme, make a template, and save that. So I can just quickly change the theme, but I have that, all the work's been done, the template's set up. And so I can pick a theme, classical, horror, suspense, any type of theme, and just lay it out on my keyboard using ReMidi, and then say, okay, what instruments do I want to, use today? Hook them up, and every time I hit a key, just... And that's just the beginning, because if you know sonokinetic, you know the orchestra, you know even emotional violin, there's just tens, and this is just one emotional violin. There's several different patches here with... So you have hundreds of different variations in articulation for this one violin alone, right? And we've been just listening to one. But as I've said before, now again, these strings, we've been listening to the strings here, but if you hit the O in Maximo, you know that every one of these opens up and you get all this variety. And just by simply hitting O, you get different strings every time. Same thing with percussion. You hit the O and you get a whole different setup. You go to Perk X and you simply go to the section where you can drag in any instrument separately, or you can have it totally reset up with one click of the button with a whole new 8 tracks of MIDI there. So you end up with just a theme with endless variations all within that perimeter of your theme. When you find tons of stuff that you will like, and you will, because in this case, if you make custom MIDI, almost every key that I hit is stuff that I personally like. You may or may not agree, but it will be in time in the theme with an ostinato or a musical line or a melody that you enjoy because you've created. But of course, you don't have one recipe of that. You have thousands on your keyboard laid out as you simply click the O in this case. So click the O, brand new look at things. Click the O here, brand new look. And as I just stated, and the same thing for the orchestra. You can see the hundreds of presets here just for one instrument, right? So, but they all will conform to your theme, because your MIDI is all created in your theme. So I hope you enjoyed this look at what I've been up to in the last several weeks. I have, I can spend easily the entire day just going through different versions of this one first theme that I've created in the classical. And I wanted to share that with you because I thought, you know, there's a lot of people that have scalar. There's a lot of people that have the Orchestra Complete. There's a lot of people that have things like PerkX and Sonokinetic and are looking for a way where instead of struggling with all the hotkeys and making it work, and that can simply have a template. And now I can open this project here. And the moment I open it up, it's all set up. I'm immediately... And if any one of these ideas grab my attention, can focus in and get 100 different varieties of that one idea, just like that. And then record it and have it. And so for me, this is an absolute joy to use because I know that instead of starting a project and having all kinds of technical issues to work out, my MIDI's playing the wrong hotkeys, which is screwing up my VST. This, one violin isn't sounding correctly. It's not picking up the right notes, whatever. It's all done automatically. The template's made. When you create an instrument and you set up your modifier for it, it's set up. You don't have to do that twice. You just save the project and you have thousands of classical ideas in C major the moment you open your project. Hope you had a chance to make music wherever you're at in the world today, and we'll see you on the next video.